been talking to you about the conscience? Well, it's simply because when you come into 1 Corinthians and you get to chapter 8, it says this, and you'll see it begins with this little phrase that we've seen already a couple of times, and we'll see it more often before we finish 1 Corinthians. Now concerning. Paul had received the letter from the church at Corinth, and obviously in the letter there were lots of questions. And if you keep that in mind, that Corinthians is an answer, sometimes it can help you to interpret it. And I've said this every single time we've got together, I think, that the real skill, of course, lies in actually trying to work out what the questions were, because we've got the answers but we're not quite sure what the questions were. But sometimes you can see things, and I'll suggest something a little bit later on in this particular session now, where something that Paul says may be more easily understood if you think of it as Paul quoting from a letter and then just passing his comment on it. See what he says in chapter 8. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet, as he ought to know. We've said this again often as we've looked at 1 Corinthians. The prevailing fault of the Corinthian church was their independence, their arrogance, their self-centeredness. I've come back to this, I think, almost every week, but I'll come back because it's almost like the theme of 1 Corinthians. It comes from the first chapter. Every one of you says, I. I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Paul, I am of Peter. That's just the pattern of it. Every single one of them supremely self-conscious. This is one of the tendencies anyway of Greek culture, but Corinth was notorious for it. It was notoriously independent. Its people were independent, the city was independent, and the church was independent. And all the problems that you find in the Corinthian church are the result of the Corinthian church's independence. If they had discerned the body and been dependent upon one another, if they had discerned the larger body and understood that they weren't self-standing as a church, but actually were interdependent with all the other churches, they wouldn't have come to the conclusion that they had all the answers and they knew everything. They had knowledge. They worshipped knowledge. And Paul will come back to this time and time again. It's interesting to see how many times knowledge is used in these next few verses. But he says, we know, how he expresses it here, if anyone thinks he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known of him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know, listen to the word again, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one. We know that by revelation to our spirit. We did serve other gods had their claims upon us, but we know now that there's only one God. I've quoted this to you before, that sometimes when we say we believe, we're really saying we're trying to believe. And people who really believe don't say I believe, they actually say I know. And Paul here says we know. That are some things we know. Concerning that verse 4, concerning the eating of things offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no other God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live, my version says. Howbeit, verse 7, this is a key verse we're coming to. Verse 7, however, there is not in everyone that knowledge. This is a really key part of what Paul is saying here. Paul says, we know that, and because we know that, can develop it, because we know that, our conscience would not be troubled in taking something that had nominally been offered to idols. In places like Corinth, actually this happens in some kind of Muslim countries as well, all animals have actually been offered to a god. I think this is pretty much what happens with halal meat, or all the meat has been offered to God. If you've bought some nice kind of Moroccan leather slippers, almost certainly the animals that wore the slippers before you had them was offered to Allah in some particular sacrifice or something like that. But we know that these gods are no gods. I will wear Moroccan slippers. I've had a Moroccan leather Bible before now. These things, they don't touch me. They don't trouble my conscience. They're of no problem to me at all. But in everyone, there's not their knowledge. They may agree with me if I say, well, there aren't any gods. They may agree with my words. They may agree with the facts that I'm saying, but they've not seen it. In them, there's not that knowledge. And conscience can only work with the information it has. It can only work with the knowledge it has. So if you have someone who, what they did in Corinth, for example, is that nearly all the animals would have been offered first of all to the gods in the different temples, and then sold on to the butchers, who then sold on the joints of meat in the shambles, and everybody would buy it. It would be almost impossible to buy a piece of meat that had not been offered to one of these gods. And Paul is really saying, now we know that it doesn't matter. We know that these are no gods. We know that it's nothing. But not everybody knows that in the way that you know it. And your conscience is at ease because you know it. So you can take these things and you can eat them, and it does you no harm. It does you no harm morally, psychologically, in your conscience. In any way at all, it does you no harm. But here's another person, and in them, there's not that knowledge. Let me read on, verse 7. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge. For some, with consciousness of the idol, until now eat it as of a thing offered to an idol. And their conscience, because their conscience doesn't have the information your conscience has, their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. But beware, verse 9, lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. And this is why I call this particular session conscience, mine versus yours. The Christian does not live only in the light of his own conscience. Because God has bound them together with other men and women, he has to be conscious, if I'm going to get my teeth in a mess with this, he has to be conscious of the conscience of other Christians. He has to know not only how his conscience will react to what he is doing, he has to be sensitive to know how somebody else's conscience will react. And if someone who doesn't have that conscience, who doesn't have the consciousness that idols are nothing, actually takes meat that has been offered to it, the meat will be haunted by his consciousness that this thing actually been offered to idols. And the judgment inside him that's setting up and saying, should I eat it, shouldn't eat it, it doesn't have the information to make the same judgment as your conscience made. And it'll make a different judgment. And if you ride roughshod over somebody else's conscience, if you're not conscious of the effect that your liberty is having on someone else's conscience, you may defile their conscience. You will damage their conscience. This delicate instrument that God has given to them, you need to be sensitive of it. There's a little phrase here, if I can see it. Verse 11, look at this little phrase. This is such a powerful statement. And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. Paul is saying Christ didn't please himself. He didn't hold on to his right to be independent. He gave up everything for the sake of others. And this is the way Christians behave. Christians don't live self-righteously in the sense of saying, well, this is all right for me, I can do it. Because Christians don't live unto themselves. They don't look upon their own things. They look also upon the things of others. That's what they do. So the decisions that they make are not for their own personal comfort and liberty. If nobody else existed, well, they could do all kinds of things. But their conscience actually is subject to the sensitivity of someone else's conscience. And I did say I would see if I could find this verse for you. I think it's probably in chapter 10. Yes, chapter 10, he returns to this theme. Chapter 10, verse 28, he says this. 10 and verse 38. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols. He's just said, incidentally, verse 27. Let's read from verse 23, I'm sorry. All things are lawful for me. I said that there may be some statements in here which are actually quotations that Paul is taking from the letter that was written to him. It may be that in the letter that was written to him, someone said, well, we're not under the law. All things are lawful to me. Now, Paul is taking up this quotation. He's not agreeing with it. He's just quoting their quotation. Because that isn't the end of the story. There's more to say. You can't just say all things are lawful for me. You have to go on and say something else. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but all things don't build up. Do you remember, and we're looking forward ahead now, when Paul begins to speak about gifts of the Spirit operating in the church, he concentrates on the exercise of those gifts which serve to build up the saints. And he actually says that speaking in tongues, if I do this myself, he says, it builds up me. But in the church, I would rather speak one word with understanding in a known tongue than 1,000, 10,000 in an unknown tongue. Because the whole issue of Corinthians is that they were not discerning the body. They weren't seeing the church. They were not living in a consciousness of what I called in one of our sessions together, the covenant community. Everyone was doing their own thing. And of course you can get away with this. You can eat what you like, you can drink what you like, you can live how you like, you can do anything you like if your conscience is easy with that. But your conscience actually is not just your own now, because other people are involved with this. And in verse 23 it says, all things are lawful for me. Sorry, verse 24. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. That was the fatal error that had crept into Corinth. They're all seeking their own. They're all doing their own things. They're all insisting on their own rights to themselves, as Oswald Chambers would have called it. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Eat whatever's sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. So you're to eat the ants if they fry the ants, and you're to eat the snake if they kind of provide you snakes, and you're to eat whatever they set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. Then he says this, but, in other words, if they're not asking any questions, don't you ask any questions. Let your conscience be the thing that guides you. If there's no other issue, you just do what your conscience gives you the judgment to do. That's fine, he says. If they're not asking any questions, don't you ask any questions. But if they are asking questions, this is what happens then, he says. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat of it. for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all the fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. This is Paul saying, because God has bound us together in this one body, in one spirit, you've all been baptized into one body, and you have responsibility for one another. And because of this, you are no longer free to do what pleases you. And here's another one of these quotations, I think, when he says here, why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? You can just imagine the Corinthians kind of writing and say, well, why should my liberty that I have got be curtailed or restricted by somebody else's conscience? God's given me liberty. God's given me revelation. I can see this clearly. I ought to live in the full liberty of this thing that God has given to me and enjoy everything, because all the earth is the Lord's and all the fullness of it. And Paul says, what about your brother? What about your brother? What effect is your liberty having on your brother? Okay, and then he says here, for if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I have given thanks? I think that also might be a quotation. I can just again imagine the Corinthians saying, well, we've sanctified this by prayer. Yeah, it did belong once to the idols, but we've sanctified it by prayer, and it's absolutely fine now. And Paul is really saying the same thing. Well, yes, for you it is fine. But if your brother is conscious of what you're doing, but does not have that revelation that you have, you need to be conscious of his consciousness and be thinking about him. Okay, so it's love that builds up the saints. That little phrase, this weak brother for whom Christ died, I think it's such a powerful statement, because at times people get so caught up with their own rights that they won't yield anything, because they're absolutely convinced that this is where you should do it, and they'll give up nothing at all. And Paul is saying he gave up everything. The only one who had any rights actually laid all of them down for this weak brother for whom you won't even lay down your preference for a nice pork steak or something like that. So for me, if in this culture that I live in, I eat pork. If I lived in a Muslim culture or a Jewish culture, I wouldn't eat it. If I lived in a Hindu culture, I wouldn't eat meat. In this multi kind of ethnic group we're in, I don't think these things are quite that sort of quite the same issue. But if I thought that this was an issue, if I thought that as they see me eating this thing, they're thinking that's been offered to idols, then for their sakes, Paul says it, doesn't he, in Romans? He says, in that case, I would eat nothing and drink nothing while the world exists, he says, rather than put a stumbling block in front of my brother. It's this is love. This is love working, and it really is thrilling. And right at the end of 1 Corinthians 10, he says this, verse 32, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they might be saved. Okay, so I'm going to pause before we move on. Any questions?